Have you ever wondered if a single moment from your childhood shaped the entire course of your life? A conversation overheard, a look exchanged, or worse, someone leaving without looking back. Brooklyn had spent years replaying the moment her mother walked out. She was only 8, but the memory was sharp, like glass pressed against her skin. The front door slamming, the echo in the hallway, the quiet sobs of her father behind his closed bedroom door, and the question that haunted her ever since: was I the reason for their divorce? Even as an adult, that thought lingered in the back of her mind, whispering every time she looked at old family photos. She had learned to smile through the pain, to bury the questions that had no answers. But some wounds, no matter how much time passes, never really heal. The past had a way of creeping up when you least expected it, and it came crashing down on her in the form of a phone call. "Brooklyn, it's about your mother," the voice on the other end said. Her breath caught in her throat. "She's gone." The words hit like a wave, but there was no grief, no tears, just an empty silence, as if the world had pressed pause. She had spent years resenting her mother for leaving. Now, there was no chance to ask why, no opportunity for closure, just an ending written before she even had a chance to turn the page. Brooklyn stared at her reflection in the window, the city lights flickering behind her. If she thought this news would bring her peace, she was wrong. The ache in her chest only deepened, heavy with unspoken words and unanswered questions. But one thing was certain: she couldn't ignore the past any longer. The drive back to her childhood home was suffocating. Brooklyn hadn't been there in years. The last time she visited, she and her father barely spoke. They exchanged polite words, carefully avoiding the one topic that hung between them like a ghost: divorce. Now, as she pulled into the driveway, she felt that familiar tightness in her chest. The house looked exactly the same, the white paint on the porch slightly faded, the same wind chimes hanging by the door. A place frozen in time. Her father, Colton, opened the door before she could knock. He looked older, his hair grayer than she remembered, his eyes carrying the weight of a man who had learned to live with unfinished stories. "Hey, Dad," she said, forcing a small smile. He nodded. "Come in." The silence inside the house was deafening. It wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of silence that held years of unspoken words. The same living room, the same furniture, the same faint scent of old books. Everything in its place, except for them. They sat at the dinner table, a plate of untouched food between them. Brooklyn toyed with her fork, her appetite lost to the tension in the air. "I'm sorry about your mother," Colton finally said, his voice rough with emotion. Brooklyn swallowed hard. Yeah. Neither of them knew what to say next. She wanted to ask him, did you ever hate her for leaving? Did she ever regret it? But the words wouldn't come. Maybe she wasn't ready to hear the answers. Instead, she asked the one question she had been too afraid to voice as a child. "Dad, why did she leave?" Colton looked up, his expression unreadable. For a moment, she thought he might brush it off like always. But then he sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "There's something you should know, Brooklyn." And just like that, the past cracked open. Brooklyn's fingers curled around the edge of the table. The air in the room thickened, pressing against her chest. Colton exhaled slowly, his gaze distant, as if he were sifting through years of memories, deciding which ones to pull into the present. "She didn't leave because of you," he finally said. His voice was quiet, almost careful. Brooklyn's breath hitched. It was the answer she had always wanted, but somehow it didn't bring the relief she expected. "She stopped loving me, Brooklyn. That's the truth." The words settled between them like a stone dropped into water, rippling outward. Brooklyn blinked. "What?" Colton leaned back, rubbing his temples. "Your mother, she wanted more. More than what I could give. More than this life." He gestured vaguely around the house, as if it represented all the dreams that had slipped through her mother's fingers. Brooklyn's mind raced. For years she had built a story in her head, one where she had done something wrong, where her parents' divorce was a consequence of her own existence. But now, the truth stood before her, raw and undeniable. "She didn't fight for us?" Brooklyn whispered. Colton's lips pressed into a thin line. She made up her mind and left. I wasn't enough for her anymore. A painful realization settled into Brooklyn's bones. Sometimes love ends quietly, long before anyone notices. She had spent her entire life carrying the weight of guilt that was never hers to bear. And now that it was gone, she didn't know what to do with the emptiness it left behind. But one thing was clear. The past had lied to her. The sound of the wind chimes outside filled the silence. Brooklyn let the truth sink in, letting it rearrange the pieces of her past. For so long, she had kept her father at arm's length. She thought he had been part of the pain, part of the unspoken resentment tied to the word divorce. But now, she saw it. He had been hurting too. "Dad," she said softly, her voice steadier than before. "I'm sorry. I never thought about what it was like for you." Colton looked up, surprise flickering in his tired eyes. "You don't have to apologize for anything." But Brooklyn did. She had spent years assuming her mother had been the only one who suffered. Now, she saw the quiet strength her father had carried. How he had stayed, even when it hurt. Divorce had torn them apart, but the truth could bring them back together. She reached for his hand, the first real gesture of closeness between them in years. "You were always enough," she whispered. Colton's grip tightened around hers, and for the first time in a long time, the silence between them didn't feel so heavy. Brooklyn sat across from her father, their hands still loosely intertwined. The silence between them was no longer filled with uncertainty. It carried something softer now, something unspoken yet understood. For years, Brooklyn had believed love was something fragile, something that shattered under the weight of imperfection. But now, she saw it differently. Love wasn't always about grand gestures or poetic promises. Sometimes, it was in the quiet presence of someone who stayed. Colton sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "You know, I never wanted you to carry this alone," he said, his voice heavy with something that sounded like regret. "I saw you struggling after the divorce. I wanted to tell you the truth, but I thought," he exhaled, "I thought it would only hurt you more." Brooklyn shook her head slowly, feeling the weight of those lost years press against her chest. "I was already hurting, Dad." Colton's expression darkened, his brows knitting together. "I know." He leaned back, staring at the ceiling as if searching for words in the patterns above. "I just didn't know how to fix it." Brooklyn swallowed hard. Maybe we don't have to fix the past." She glanced down at their intertwined hands. "Maybe we just start from here." Her father's gaze met hers, and for the first time in a long time, Brooklyn felt something shift between them, a bridge forming where there had once been distance. Colton chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You always were wiser than your years." Brooklyn smiled, a quiet warmth settling in her chest. Maybe she had spent too long looking for answers in the past, when all along, what mattered most was right here, in the present. The pain of the divorce would never fully disappear. But it no longer defined her, and for the first time in years, she felt free. The days passed in a blur of quiet conversations and unspoken understanding. Brooklyn found herself lingering in her father's presence more often, helping him with small tasks, sharing meals, watching old movies they never used to watch together. It was as if time had stretched between them, giving them a second chance to know each other. One evening, as they sat on the back porch, Brooklyn hesitated before speaking. "Do you think she regretted it?" Colton didn't ask who she meant. He simply stared out at the sky, the colors of dusk bleeding into the horizon. "Maybe," he said finally. "Or maybe she did what she thought she had to do." Brooklyn let his words sink in. For so long she had needed to know why. She had wanted a reason, something to justify the pain. But now, she realized, sometimes there was no grand explanation. Sometimes people simply left. And sometimes the ones who stayed were the ones who mattered most. Colton turned to her, his gaze steady. "But I never regretted staying." Brooklyn felt something break and mend all at once. The years of quiet resentment, the distance, the misunderstandings, they no longer mattered. She reached for his hand once more, this time with a quiet certainty. "Neither do I." The word divorce had once felt like a scar she couldn't erase. But now, she saw it differently. It wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning of something new. Brooklyn stood in her childhood home, gazing at the walls that had silently witnessed the unraveling of her family. Once these walls had carried the weight of her mother's absence, the echo of unanswered questions, and the lingering ache of divorce. But now, they felt different. Lighter somehow. As if time had rewritten the story they once held. Her father moved beside her, his presence steady. "You know," he said, breaking the quiet, "when your mother left, I spent years blaming myself." His voice was calm, but there was something raw beneath it. Brooklyn turned to him. "You did?" Colton nodded. "At first, I told myself it was because I wasn't enough. That if I had done something differently, she would have stayed." He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "But the truth is, some people leave, no matter how much you love them." Brooklyn felt the weight of those words settle inside her. They mirrored her own thoughts, the same ones she had carried since she was a child, wondering if she had been the reason for the divorce. "I used to think it was my fault," she admitted, her voice softer now. "Like maybe, if I'd been different, better, she wouldn't have left." Colton's eyes filled with something deep, something that spoke of all the years they had lost to silence. "Brooklyn," he said firmly, "her decision was never about you." The words settled into her bones, unraveling years of misplaced guilt. It had taken her entire life to hear them, to truly believe them. For so long, she had let divorce define her. She had let it shape the way she saw herself, the way she carried her relationships, the way she feared love and abandonment in equal measure. But now, she saw the truth. Divorce hadn't broken her. It had shaped her. Brooklyn exhaled slowly, the air in her lungs feeling lighter than it had in years. "I don't hate her, you know." Colton gave a small nod. "Neither do I." It was strange, the way time softened even the sharpest edges. Brooklyn had spent so many years fearing the past, running from it, resenting it. But now, she saw it for what it was, just an episode, not the whole story. She turned to her father, really looking at him. The man who had stayed, the man who had endured the same pain she had, but had never left her side. "I'm glad we have this now," she said, her voice steady. Colton smiled, something warm and knowing in his expression. "Me too." Brooklyn knew the past would always be there. Divorce would always be a part of their story. But it no longer held the power it once did. It no longer defined who she was, or the love she was capable of giving and receiving. She squeezed her father's hand one last time before stepping outside, feeling the crisp evening air on her skin. And for the first time in a long time, she walked forward, without looking back. Some endings aren't meant to break us. They're meant to set us free.